what people don't realize is I think they focus on the tasks from the ACS, but setting personal minimums is a required task. And if you don't do so, you can actually fail a practical exam for not setting personal minimums.
That's Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro talking about personal minimums. Hello again and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. I'm the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, G3000, G5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today we're talking with Catherine about how some of our personal minimums can expand and contract due to proficiency, while others remain constant. She and I will talk about our own personal minimums, plus she has lots of great stories about personal minimums, including some from check rides she's given, and you just gotta love the stories. Last week in episode 231, we talked about the crash of a Pilatus PC-12 that occurred on takeoff in 1/2 mile visibility in snow in Chamberlain, South Dakota, and the many mistakes that were made, including the last one that doomed the plane. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/231. And this is a listener-supported show. We are still ad-free, but I would encourage you to do what many of your friends have done: sign up to become a member to support the show. You can do that by just going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. You'll find a link to that in our show notes. And you can then sign up with your credit card to make a donation to the show. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. This week in the news, FAA revokes pilot certificates for Red Bull plane swap stunt. Regional airline asks the FAA to let it hire pilots with less experience. And an illegal charter results in the death of a murder suspect. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, FAA revokes pilot certificate for Red Bull plane swap stunt. The FAA has revoked the pilot certificates of Luke Aikens and Andy Farrington following their highly publicized attempt to take off in one aircraft and land in another after sending their planes into a nosedive and jumping out of them last month. The attempt ended with Aikens successfully making the swap, while Farrington parachuted to the ground when one of the aircraft spiraled out of control and crashed. No one was injured in the stunt, which was put on by Red Bull and live-streamed by Hulu. Quote, the FAA revoked the pilot certificates of the two pilots involved in the unauthorized Red Bull plane swap stunt on April 24th in Arizona, the agency said in a statement. The attempted stunt resulted in the crash of one of the two single-engine Cessna 182 aircraft. The lead pilot requested an exemption for the stunt from the FAA, which the agency denied. As previously reported by AvWeb, the request denied by the FAA was made by Aikens and asked for an exemption from regulations prohibiting required crew members from leaving their stations while an aircraft is in flight. Aikens, who served as project lead and chief pilot for the Red Bull plane swap, claimed responsibility for moving forward with the stunt in a statement posted on Instagram. He also noted he had not shared information regarding the denied exemption with his team. The FAA's emergency revocation orders require Aikens and Farrington to surrender their certificates immediately. Neither one will be able to apply for or be issued new airman certificates for a year, after which time they will have to take all new check rides. The agency has also proposed a fine of $4,932 for Aikens for the violation of three regulations, including 91.105 regarding required flight crew members remaining at their stations, 91.113 regarding the duty of the pilot to see and avoid other aircraft, and 91.13 regarding not operating an aircraft in a careless and reckless manner. From thepointsguy.com, regional airline asked the FAA to let it hire pilots with less experience. With pilots in short supply, one regional is asking federal officials to allow them to hire first officers with far fewer hours than would normally be allowed. Republic Airways, the nation's second-largest regional carrier, which operates Embraer 170s and 175s for American, Delta, and United, said in a filing with the FAA that it wants an exemption to be permitted to hire pilots who graduate from its flight academy when they reach 750 flight hours. That's half the 1,500 hours of experience required of most pilots. Among regional airlines, Indianapolis-based Republic is in a unique situation, and it didn't pull the 750 number out of thin air. Republic is the only regional airline to own and operate its own flight training program for participants with little to no experience. The Lift Academy, short for Leadership in Flight Training, operates under a set of rules that allow certain programs that operate in conjunction with universities to reduce the number of hours required to receive what's known as a restricted ATP certificate. Airline Transport Pilot Certificates, also known as the ATP or RATP, are required for first officers to fly for the airlines. It's the result of safety reforms implemented in the wake of the Colgan Air flight crash in 2009. Hours can be reduced in 3 different ways to receive an RATP. A student who conducts flight training in conjunction with a 2-year college program is eligible for the certificate in 1,250 hours, while a student who attends a 4-year college program is eligible at 1,000 hours. Republic is targeting the 3rd way for military veterans who are eligible for an RATP certificate at just 750 hours. In its FAA filing, Republic argues that there are many similarities between its Lift Academy program and military training. This includes being a closed-loop system that it says is closely aligned with the standard operating procedures and flight operations at the regional airline. Not only are students learning to fly, but they're learning the airlines and its operations concurrently, Republic said. The exemption request was actually filed last month, but went little noticed until executives from a competing airline mentioned it on an earnings call this week. It's the furthest known step a regional airline has taken to chip away at the 1,500-hour rule. The rule, which took effect in 2013, has come under renewed scrutiny as the industry faces a pilot shortage. Many in the industry have called for it to end, though others have countered that the extra experience is a good thing, helping ensure an adequate supply of flight instructors. With Republic squarely in the corner of being against the 1,500-hour rule, the airline also uses its filing to argue that this exemption would help make becoming an airline pilot more financially feasible for students, as well as diversify the flight deck. From news.yahoo.com, pilots say they're being blamed for plane crashes that aren't their fault, and this will be of particular interest to Cessna pilots. Security cameras captured the 2012 crash landing of a Cessna 150 near the Pitkins County Airport in Jasper, Georgia. The 2 pilots suffered serious injury. That was 10 years ago, but when pilot Dave Matthews saw Channel 2 WSB's investigation, he said it all came rushing back. Matthews wasn't just on a routine flight. He had just purchased the plane that day and was conducting a top-to-bottom review. A post-crash investigation by the NTSB found water-contaminated fuel. And like so many of the pilots that the reporter spoke with, the NTSB blamed the pilot, saying his pre-flight inspection was inadequate. But Matthews said he checked for water twice. Quote, "The plane I knew had been sitting outside for the past couple of months, so water in the fuel line was a very front-of-mind concern to us. We were surprised that there wasn't any water," Matthews said. In February, Channel 2's investigative reporter Justin Gray uncovered crash after crash where water was found in the fuel in some of the most popular planes in the sky. Since then, Gray did more digging all the way back to 1982 and found 307 Cessna crashes from water contamination with 37 deaths. "What I can tell you with absolute certainty is that there was no water that was detectable from the ways we were supposed to verify whether there was water there," said Matthews. "The fuel tanks are severely flawed," Bob Scoville said. Scoville, who hangars his aircraft at a Tennessee airport, has a 1981 Cessna 172P. For nearly 40 years, he's kept it in a hangar and maintained the plane, even though he refuses to fly it. He alerted the FAA back in 1999 after 3 forced landings triggered by undetectable water in his fuel tanks. The FAA witnessed several experiments conducted on the plane. Photos from one of those tests shows 32 ounces of water, dyed red, poured into the tanks to see what it does. An FAA memo says how, after sumping, even shaking the wings, 13 ounces of water remained entrapped inside the tank. Gray was there when Scoville did a similar test again with water dyed red. After a few sumps, the fuel is clear of water in the test, but inside the tank, the red dye water is collected and hiding. Water just lays in the bottom of the tank, Scoville said. Channel 2's Gray followed a paper trail starting in 1999 when the FAA sent a letter to Cessna after Scoville's test, determining, quote, "an unsafe condition exists and design changes are necessary." But 8 years later, in 2007, the FAA sent Cessna another letter reversing its findings, giving the planes a clean bill of health after Cessna performed their own test. The FAA wrote, quote, "there was no reaction of the test aircraft's engine to the deliberate water contamination." and went on to say that based on those tests, their original concerns and warnings were, quote, incorrect. With that letter, the FAA closed the case and no design changes were mandated, but planes kept crashing. A Cessna spokesperson told Channel 2 that Scoville's theory was, quote, carefully investigated and tested by Cessna with direct FAA participation and oversight. They say no safety concerns were found to exist and the matter was closed by the FAA. Now, one thing this story doesn't mention is that when Cessna restarted their piston production lines in 1997, they went from 1 fuel drain in each wing to 5 fuel drains in each wing. And that change was probably made to address this issue. So regardless of what aircraft you fly, please check carefully for water in the tanks. And from multiple sources, a Cessna crashed on a bridge in Miami this past weekend. This comes from an email from NATCA, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. NATCA is shocked and extremely saddened to report the passing of veteran Miami air traffic controller and devoted union member Narciso Torres, who was aboard a single-engine Cessna 172 that crash-landed Saturday on the Haulover Inlet Bridge north of Miami Beach, Florida on A1A. 2 other family members were on board and survived, though one has significant burns. 5 people were taken to the hospital, including a woman and 2 children who were inside an SUV that was hit head-on by the plane. According to the FAA, the aircraft took off from Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport, headed for Key West, and lost engine power soon after takeoff. Police said the SUV was traveling southbound over the bridge when the Cessna hit it head-on, causing the plane to flip over and burst into flames. Someone who was driving by recorded cell phone video of the woman inside the SUV as she jumped out and pulled her 2 toddlers from the mangled SUV. Speaking with reporters hours later, MDPD Detective Alvaro Zabaleta addressed the collision. He said, quote, it is miraculous that you're traveling in a vehicle, the driver with the 2 toddlers, and you're in a head-on collision with an aircraft, and everybody's okay. MDFR spokesperson Erica Benitez provided details on the surviving victims. Quote, 2 of them were on the aircraft and suffered traumatic injuries and were transported to local trauma centers, she said. Police said the woman and children who were inside the SUV were taken to an area hospital as a precaution. Dashcam video from another SUV on the bridge shows a significant amount of traffic in both directions and the aircraft flying low over the SUV. And we have a link to that dashcam video in our show notes. Also, AvWeb's Paul Bertorelli, who we had on this show in episode 225, just released a video in which he reviews the survival rate of ditching a GA aircraft in the water. He points out that for ditchings that occur in calm waters close to land, that about 90% of these ditchings have no fatalities. But he said that pilots often avoid ditchings because of a fear that a plane will flip over, but that often doesn't occur. While he doesn't question the pilot's choice of landing on a busy bridge, the implication is obvious, which is that if this 172 had landed in the water instead of on the bridge, it certainly wouldn't have hit a car, and there's an excellent chance that everyone would have survived. From BusinessWire.com, Textron announces delivery of first Cessna Sky Courier to FedEx Express. Textron Aviation announced the first delivery of the Cessna Sky Courier twin utility turboprop to FedEx. This is the first of 50 freighter aircraft that global logistics firm FedEx Express ordered as the Cessna Sky Courier's launch customer. The clean sheet aircraft achieved FAA type certification in March of 2022. In addition to the initial fleet order, FedEx Express has options for 50 more Sky Courier aircraft. Members of the FedEx Express design and engineering teams participated in Textron Aviation's customer advisory board to help shape the aircraft's design, features, and serviceability. The Cessna Sky Courier twin-engine high-wing turboprop offers a combination of performance and lower operating costs for air freight, passenger, and special mission operators. In addition to the freighter version, there is a 19-passenger variant of the Sky Courier that includes separate crew and passenger entries for smooth boarding, as well as large cabin windows for natural light and view. Both configurations offer single-point pressure refueling to enable faster turnarounds. The aircraft is powered by 2 wing-mounted Pratt & Whitney PT6A-65SC turboprop engines and features the Macaulay Propeller C779, a heavy-duty and reliable 110-inch aluminum 4-blade propeller. The Sky Courier uses the Garmin G1000 NXI avionics, and it has a maximum cruise speed of more than 200 knots and a 900 nautical mile maximum range. From the GrandForksHerald.com, Cirrus seeks more workers in Duluth to catch up with demand. You could say Cirrus Aircraft faces an enviable problem. Cirrus CEO Sean Nielsen said the company has nearly doubled its production of aircraft in the past 3 years, yet long lead times persist. Quote, so from a demand perspective, the last 2 years, we've actually been outselling our production capacity by quite a margin, which is good. So the backlog is really healthy. It's actually at a record level right now for both the Jet and the SR, Nielsen said. A Cirrus customer looking to buy an aircraft today could reasonably expect to take delivery of an order for most models no sooner than late 2024. Nielsen wants to shorten those lead times, but that's no simple proposition given labor and supply constraints. In a tight local labor market, Nielsen said Cirrus has appreciably increased the wages and benefits it offers and has been actively advertising its employment opportunities both for experienced and entry-level positions. It also has been promoting the mobility its employees enjoy with multiple avenues to advance in the company. 3 years ago, Cirrus employed about 1,300 people. Today, that number is around 2,100, with more than 1,200 working in Duluth. And Nielsen said the company is looking to fill another 400 positions this year. Cirrus also has a production facility in Grand Forks, North Dakota. While Nielsen wouldn't say exactly what that meant for production goals, he said it stands to reason Cirrus would expect to see corresponding growth in output. In 2021, Cirrus shipped 528 new aircraft, booking almost $633 million in sales, according to the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. That's nearly a 16% increase in business compared to what it did in 2019 prior to the pandemic. From avweb.com, Embraer to hire 1,000 new employees. Embraer announced that it's looking for around 1,000 new employees to fill positions at its facilities in Brazil. According to the company, the newly opened jobs will support its recovering production rate, services and support growth, product development, and new businesses. Embraer noted that it has openings in areas including operations, engineering, and administration. Citing estimates that the volume of aircraft delivered this year will increase between 15 and 25% compared to 2021, Embraer said it's expecting company growth and post-COVID recovery to continue for several years. Hiring plans include more permanently remote positions and hybrid work models aimed at supporting a more flexible environment, which matches employees' interests while strengthening the culture of innovation and knowledge generation. Embraer reported that it employed approximately 18,000 people as of the end of 2021. By the way, I went on their U.S. website and I counted over 120 job openings in the United States for mostly southern U.S. locations that Embraer has. From WDBJ7.com, runners participate in the first runway 5K at Roanoke-Blacksburg Regional Airport. Runners took to the runway for the first runway 5K at Roanoke-Blacksburg Regional Airport on Saturday. Even gloomy skies couldn't keep more than 500 runners from participating in the race. Before the runners hit the tarmac, a $25,000 donation was made to the Carl Lyon Cancer Center. The race was in honor of Julie Givons, the late wife of the airport's director of finance. Mike Stewart, Roanoke-Blacksburg Regional Airport Executive Director, said, quote, "Get out here, honor her, and at the same time, raise some funds for a very worthy cause." And a runner, Daniel Colassa, said, "I love how much money was raised for cancer research. I find that's very important to do this and events like this. The airport hopes to make this an annual tradition." And I've mentioned this in the past. This is a great way for an airport to get involved with its local community, so you may want to suggest holding a 5K run at the airport to your local airport management. From InterestingEngineering.com, Hawaiian Airlines is building an all-electric sea glider that holds 100 passengers. News has surfaced that Hawaiian Airlines has joined forces with aerospace and maritime company Regent to engineer the initial design of its next-generation 100-person capacity all-electric sea glider known as the Monarch. The move makes Hawaiian Airlines Regent's first U.S.-based design partner for the Monarch. The innovative new vehicle is slated for entry into commercial service by 2028. Quote, "Innovative inter-island transportation has been core to our business since 1929 when we replaced steamships with airplanes. We are excited to be an early investor in Regent and to be involved in developing their largest sea glider, a vehicle with great potential for Hawaii," said Avis Manis, Chief Marketing and Communications Officer at Hawaiian Airlines. The all-electric sea glider is a zero-emission vehicle that, when completed, will provide harbor-to-harbor overwater transportation at a fraction of the cost, noise, and emissions of existing regional transportation modes like aircraft and ferries. The development is bound to revolutionize how people in Hawaii travel and more specifically, how they hop from island to island. And finally from avweb.com, fugitive flight may have been an illegal charter. The pilot of the Cherokee 140 that crashed on a night flight in the Canadian wilderness in April, killing 2 alleged gangsters and 2 pilots, had been accused of operating an illegal charter service. The aircraft crashed near Sioux Lookout in northern Ontario, and the passengers, Jean Larkamp and Dustin Bailey, were on the run on murder-related charges. According to the Vancouver Sun, the 26-year-old pilot in command of the airplane, Abhinav Honda, had been reported to Transport Canada by another pilot at his home field of Boundary Bay Airport near Vancouver for flying people for money. Azam Azami, who is a flight instructor and ferry pilot at Boundary Bay, told The Sun he responded to an ad on Facebook Marketplace offering charters for $300 an hour or $2,000 a day. He messaged the company behind the ad and posed as a prospective client and confirmed the company, which named Honda as the pilot, was offering flights for hire without the operator certificate required to fly charters. Transport Canada confirmed it had received the complaint, but did not tell The Sun if it had been investigated. In late April, the aircraft hopscotched across Western Canada with the ultimate destination of Toronto before taking off from Dryden, Ontario at 9:09 p.m. on April 29th. It was in the air for about an hour before crashing in dense brush about 25 miles south of Sioux Lookout. Honda's friend and fellow pilot, Han Kun Hong, was also killed. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, our conversation with Catherine Cavagnaro about personal minimums that expand and contract. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And we'll get to our conversation with Catherine in just a moment, but first a quick update and a few of your emails. I'll be flying out to Raleigh, North Carolina next week on Monday, May 23rd, and then over the next couple of days I'll be bringing back a brand new Cirrus SR20 to California, where it will go on the flight line at the West Valley Flying Club where I teach. And I'll be bringing along the GoPro cameras and shooting some video on that trip, so Patreon supporters can expect to see some of that in the weeks ahead. From the Good News Department, Patreon supporter Armin Eskijian, congratulations to you, sir, on your instrument rating. He says, Max, thanks for all of your hard work and dedication. Your show is very informative and it has helped me become a more proficient pilot. On April 27th, I officially became IFR rated. I originally got my private back in 1991 at the legal age of 17. My IFR training took about a year and a half. Work and life just got in the way. I'm a proud supporter of your show and will make sure my credit card never drops offline. Looking forward to sharing the journey. Cheers, Armin. Well, Armin, thanks so much for that. And new Patreon supporter Mike Bickle wrote and said, Hey, Max, I'm a field service engineer. I've held a private for the past 15 years with a little over 500 hours. I regularly listen to your podcast while traveling on the road. And on May 17th, I'll be driving to Charleston, South Carolina, and then to the D.C. area, and then hopefully home, which I think is in southeast Pennsylvania. With all this driving, I figure I might as well keep my knowledge up on aviation, as they say, keep the rust off. I hear you speak to the value of the information you give out versus how much you'd have to spend on a CFI, so I decided to send some funds your way to keep up the good work. Recently, someone was saying that renting a 172 is about $250 an hour. Not sure how FBOs and flight schools are going to fare that storm. The time around 9/11 was bad with prices like that. I wonder. And just to comment on that, the most expensive 172 we have at my flight club is a 2020 172, and it rents for $220 an hour. Most of our G1000 planes are just under $200 an hour, but that is just for the airplane, and of course it's extra for a flight instructor. He continues, I belong to a club of 10 guys, and we own a PA-28 Piper Cherokee 235B with a controllable pitch prop, and currently stationed out of N47, which is the airport they're currently at. The club has been around since 1947. That's incredible. And in fact, is the second oldest club in Pennsylvania. For many years, it was hangared at Oscar 03 in Morgantown, PA, not far from Reading. Sadly, they're going to close Oscar 03 and going to put up houses, which is why we had to get a new hangar. The owner is getting up in years, and that's the way the world goes. Well, thanks so much for sharing that information, Mike. And here's a message from Patreon supporter Andras Medveksky. He says regarding episode 230, which was about the Cessna 208 accident in Idaho, he said that was very educational. I also noticed the inaccuracy of the moving map in my Garmin GTN 650. In the 650's pilot guide, there is a warning message, quote, "Do not use base map, land and water data for primary navigation." No wonder it is called a base map, and as you had pointed out, no one should use that for navigational purposes. However, there is a separate database called Obstacles and Terrain that can help a lot in enhancing situation awareness, but only if the database is up to date, because sadly many pilot operators prefer to save money on the database updates. Thanks so much for that, Andres. And yes, I mentioned in 230 that you cannot use a moving map for primary navigation. You must use your instruments. And unfortunately, I think people just get so used to using moving maps that sometimes people trust them, and you can't. They're really just for secondary purposes. And here's an email from patron supporter William Remington. This is in reference to episode 230 about the Cessna 208 caravan crash in Burley, Idaho, and about the video that I posted for Patreon supporters in which I flew that approach in a simulator. He said, "Really interesting, Max. I greatly appreciated the details around your analyses. Sad ending for the pilot. I continue to be a $20 a month subscriber through Patreon because of the immense value and education you provide. Thank you, Bill." Well, thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. And a couple people commented on a post that I did referencing episode 231, which was about the Pilatus PC-12 crash in Chamberlain, South Dakota. I posted for Patreon supporters a video that shows the PC-12 as it's taxiing for takeoff. And in that video, you can see there is still snow and or ice on top of the elevator. And then a second video I posted shows the aircraft taking off and immediately disappearing into the snow and clouds. And 30 seconds after takeoff, it was back on the ground again, having killed 9 of the 12 occupants. The comments on that video that I posted on Patreon, the first one from Nathan Ballard, he says, "Excellent. He had sad recap on the podcast. The hazardous attitudes tell the story. But then to see the videos posted above, wow. I can't imagine wanting to fly in those conditions, much less with family members on board. Tragic." And from Sparky, commenting on the same video, he said, "No chance I would have flown unless a full de-ice like the airlines I flew could have performed. Holdover times based on conditions would have been very short too." So his point there is that he basically would have spent very little time on the ground. And of course, that aircraft was on the ground overnight, which is why it picked up so much snow and ice. And just to mention more about my videos, I usually post 2 to 3 of them each month. The most recent ones were of that PC-12 taxiing for takeoff and also taking off into the snowstorm. And prior to that, I took a video of me flying my club's flight simulator on the approach into Burley, Idaho, where the Cessna 208 crashed last month. And prior to that, I shot about 20 minutes of night landings with a student pilot in a Cirrus SR20 at 3 local airports, including San Jose International. And as part of that, I did some comparisons of different settings on the GoPros for shooting at night and also compare them to the same landings shot with an iPhone 11. And if you'd like to see these videos and all of the past and future videos, just sign up to become a member and support the show financially via Patreon. To do that, it's really easy. Just go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Once you're there, it'll take you just a couple of minutes to create an account, enter your credit card information, and choose the dollar amount at which you'd like to support the show. For example, the $20 a month level gets you access to the videos, and the $35 a month level also gets you access to my online courses about the G1000. Now let's see if you know any of these people who just signed up in the last week, and if you do, say hello to them. We have new signups at the $35 a month level from Jim Considine and from Mike Bickle, and we also have new supporters Bradley Smock and Brent Ladbrook. Thank you so much for supporting the show. And now let me tell you a little bit about Catherine Cavagnaro. She's an expert on spins, aerobatics, and upset recovery, and owns a flight school called Ace Aerobatics School that's located at the Sewanee Franklin County Airport on the campus of the University of the South. In addition to holding ATP and CFI certificates, she also has a PhD in math. She's a professor of mathematics at the University of the South and is chair of the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. Catherine is the 2020 National Certificated Flight Instructor of the Year, and she also serves as a designated pilot examiner. And now here's our conversation with Catherine Cavagnaro. Catherine, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me back, Max. It's always fun.
Yeah, indeed it is. Now, you suggested we talk about personal minimums. I know that you have an article out in AOPA Pilot Magazine, the June issue. Tell us what was the inspiration for that? What's kind of the key point that you're talking about in the beginning of the article there?
Yeah, this is a tough story. A little over a year ago, I got a call about an accident that happened out of Gainesville, Georgia. And the pilot, who was had just received his instrument rating just a few months before, took off maybe about 10 minutes before sunset into low IFR. So it was about a 400-foot ceiling with 4 miles visibility in a new-to-him airplane with a new-to-him instrument panel. He was going on a trip to Florida with his wife and his brother on board. And it looks like as soon as he went into IMC, he transferred over to departure, and they gave him about a 30-degree turn to the right. And he commenced that turn and went past the 30 degrees and then just descended into terrain. And, all 3 people perished. And it's such a tragic accident. It was especially, it stung for me because I was the designated examiner who gave him his private pilot check ride. I'm not sure where along the way he got his instrument rating, but it was about a year and a half before the accident that I did his private pilot check ride. So, my thought is, how many red flags do we need before we put the airplane back in the hangar? So, night flight in low IMC, new panel, new to him airplane, family on board. All of those just add up to me to put the plane back in the hangar. And, I confess I had probably a lot of sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, wondering, did I miss a hazardous attitude that, maybe I could have caught during his private pilot check ride, and things might have entered or have ended differently with a happier ending for that family. So, that was the inspiration for my June AOPA pilot article. And I'll tell you later some instances with practical exams where it's really frustrating to see pilots who haven't assembled a system of personal minimums that, will hopefully keep us all flying as long as possible.
Well, I know what you mean about sleepless nights. I'm thinking back to a gentleman that I had flown with. I didn't teach him his instrument, or even introduce him to Cirrus, but had flown with him a number of times, and he ended up crashing. And I had the same question. And I think sometimes pilots present slightly different personas to examiners and to flight instructors. I've gone back and thought about it, and everything about this gentleman spoke safety. There was absolutely no red flags whatsoever. And yet afterwards, I learned that he had done some low altitude flying, that did not meet the rules prior to his accident, something that he'd never told me about. So, I think sometimes it's just impossible to catch because pilots don't always let us know about all of the things that they think are acceptable.
Yeah, it's a shame that we just get that 1 4-hour snapshot. And, hopefully we can sense some of these things that might cause a problem later, but we can't always. And that's frustrating for me as an examiner. And honestly, it made me a bit angry that someone would see all of those red flags. The preliminary report is out, so, it's not the final report. So I don't know exactly the cause of the descent into terrain, but the preliminary report alone paints a pretty staggering picture with all of those red flags. Another one with which you might be familiar is the Bonanza V35 crash late last year out of Visalia. And it's a similar situation. The preliminary report is out. But in that case, this pilot took off during the night into, again, low IMC. I think this was something like 100-foot ceiling and 1.5 miles visibility at night, and he had his 2 daughters and a nephew on board. So you've got 4 people in a V-35, which I have to say, I have a Bonanza as well, but I think real hard before putting 4 people in my Bonanza. Anyway, again, the details are similar. He takes off and doesn't really even get much past the airport property and, descends into the terrain. So I don't know exactly what the cause is, and I won't speculate on that. But again, come on. Low IFR at night with family on board. What are you doing? So it's frustrating.
Yeah, that particular accident was interesting because the weather changed rather rapidly, and it was in December, and in that part of the Central Valley, which is the southern half of the Central Valley of California, they have a phenomenon that they call Thule fog, and they get fairly thick fog throughout much of the winter, so much so that schools in Visalia have delayed openings. They'll start at 10 o'clock on really foggy days, simply because it's so difficult to move around in the heavy fog. Now, in that particular case, probably in the time frame he was headed to the airport, it was VFR, but within a very short period of time, possibly in the time that he started loading the aircraft and so on, it went to IFR. And of course, it's pretty hard to see those clouds at night when you're out in rural areas. So he might have reasonably thought, hey, VFR, we're headed back home to Sacramento, no problem. And yet, if you don't check the weather periodically, things can change very rapidly. Now, the common theme on both of these was family on board. How do you think that affects decision making when people are going on a trip?
Oh, you can imagine the pressure. I know that in the first accident of which I spoke, I believe that was a vacation in Florida. And of course, we don't want to disappoint family, right? But, sometimes we have to be the heavy and just say, you know what, this is not going to work out. Personally, whenever I feel like I have to be someplace, whether it's a business trip or whether it's an event that I'm attending with my kids, I always get backup airline tickets. That removes that pressure. I love Southwest because you can, reuse the funds if the weather is great. Like I just went to New Hampshire last week and I had backup airline tickets because I needed to be there. Fortunately, the weather was great and I was able to fly myself. And so I ended up delaying those funds and I'll use them at a later date. But feeling like you need to not disappoint family, feeling like you need to get to a business meeting or whatever have you. Those are the external pressures I think that we all need to be really careful about.
Yeah, I can think of numerous accidents that involved family, and they were the holiday trips or the vacation trips, the trips of a lifetime. And you just have to think about, wow, how much pressure is on the pilot. Everybody is looking to the pilot. Gee, the pilot spent 20, 30 grand getting his certificates. He spent even more buying an airplane. And now there's some desire to show that, hey, that was all worthwhile. I can see how pilots don't want to disappoint family. But holy cow, the consequences are so huge that it really makes sense to have an honest discussion with them about the risk. I think if pilots had an honest discussion every time they faced really bad weather and difficult decisions with passengers, the passengers would be, hey, no problem. I'd rather wait than, potentially end up in a crash.
And, even if not, they'll get over it. Right. So, yeah, it's just not worth it.
Now, you mentioned in that first crash, new panel, new airplane. Talk a little bit about kind of the new panel aspect with instrument flying.
Oh my gosh. So I have recently redone my panel in the Bonanza. So it started out with that, 1960s pictures of wood kind of vibe going on where, half the stuff was in op. But it still had the standard vacuum instruments, even though she actually did have a WAS GPS, an old 430 WAS. And I had a total gut job done on it. So every wire is new in that airplane. So it's a full glass display. And I'll tell you, you get a new panel and it's like night and day. And here's what's interesting. given that it's not just, say, a G1000 or a G3000 system that you get with a new airplane. When we redo our panels, we all do them in different ways, right? I choose a different combination of navigator and display and autopilot. And, you might choose something a little different. So, it can be a little bit like Frankenstein's airplane, right? So, we need to avail ourselves of some good instruction on how to best use the tools in our own panel. And again, there are thousands of different combinations of panels. And so therefore, there are thousands of different ways to best use it. So, I jumped in a friend's Bonanza mine is all Garmin and his is Avidyne. It took me a while to figure out how to set his transponder because it was remote and it wasn't really obvious to me. Anyway, so different panels can be just like night and day. And so you really need to be careful and get proper training before you launch into IFR, not to mention, of course, low IFR, which that's actually against one of my personal minimums. But if you're going to launch into IFR, you owe it to yourself to get proper training on that panel.
Yeah, I agree. There are thousands of combinations, and I tend to fly mostly G1000 aircraft, and even among G1000 aircraft, among different manufacturers' models, different software revisions, there are probably at least hundreds, if not thousands of permutations in just that one panel alone. And part of the reason I specialize in glass is I kind of recognized early on, hey, this stuff is going to be challenging, and it makes sense to really become an expert in an area where people need a lot of help. And yes, I think anytime someone moves to a new airplane, they definitely need help in learning how to fly that airplane. Anytime they move to a new panel, they're going to need a lot of time behind the panel with a qualified instructor so that they fully understand what's going on. And I've seen even very experienced pilots make really big mistakes when they fly IFR. How could a low time, pilot just brand new to a particular panel think that they were going to pull that off successfully?
I'll tell you, I'm at a loss. No words.
Yeah. And it probably comes back to family on board. I have a strong suspicion that was probably the motivational factor there. Well, as an examiner, you give practical exams and you see pilots that sometimes not passed because of personal minimums. Talk about some of your experiences as an examiner with pilots and relate that to personal minimums.
Right. Yeah. What people don't realize is I think they focus on the tasks from the ACS, but setting personal minimums is a required task. And if you don't do so, you can actually fail a practical exam for not setting personal minimums. For example, let's talk about fuel for a minute. So we typically we always have people do a navlog for the private, commercial, and instrument rating. And I usually ask, okay, make sure that they know how to compute the fuel that they're going to need for that flight. And then I want to know what their personal minimum is for reserve fuel. So I need them to know what's FAA legal, but I also want to know what is comfortable to them. For example, FAA legal for a VFR flight is 30 extra minutes. In my Bonanza, my personal minimum is at least an hour and a half. So I triple those for my Bonanza. Your mileage may vary. You might have different minimums, but I want to see that people are assembling minimums that make sense. And that I understand that feels comfortable. So, for some people, maybe it's an hour and that's fine. I just happen to have pretty conservative fuel, requirements just personally. But, sometimes I'll see people say, well, I'll say, well, how about 30 minutes? Suppose that you've calculated the fuel requirements and you have exactly 30 minutes reserve, or that's what you plan to have, or that's what your calculations say. And that's exactly what you have in the airplane. Fuel truck's broken. You're not going to get any fuel. Okay. Will you do the flight? And I see the candidate squirm a bit. And then he or she says something like, well, that makes me kind of uncomfortable. I'd only do that if I had to. And I said, okay, well, what are the circumstances under which you feel like you would have to go? And I hear, and I've heard this a number of times, well, if I was told that I would lose my job. And I'll tell you, all of the air goes out of me. I'm beside myself. What are you doing? People misunderstand what personal minimums are. Personal minimums are reserves, say in this case, for fuel that go beyond FAA legal. And it is something that you don't break. Even if your boss says you're going to be fired, if your spouse says it's over, whatever the case is, you do not violate those. So these are hard and fast rules. And I think we're going to talk later, Max, about how it makes sense for our personal minimums sometimes to expand and contract with recent experience. For fuel, though, mine do not. Mine don't ever change. But people must not understand what personal minimums are if they're willing to break them under pressure. So I'll tell you, being an examiner can sometimes be a bit frustrating, Max.
Yeah, fuel is so incredibly important. Last time I looked, somewhere on the order of 11 to 12% of all accidents in the U.S. were fuel related. Most of those fuel starvation. People just ran out of fuel. And so if people were to take nothing away from this discussion today and just always, never exceed the personal minimums on fuel, wow, we could eliminate virtually all of those particular accidents. And then regarding jobs, I just read online in the comments related to an accident that I was looking at. Somebody said, and I have lost 2 jobs in the past. And I thought, good for you. And he basically was saying that, he honored his personal minimums. He got fired. He's lost 2 jobs. And to me, that should be a badge of honor. Most places you're going to find that, the management is reasonable. They'll let you make the decision. Some places, people really want their people to push the limits. And if they really thought about it, I think they would realize, no, just a single fatal accident would not be worth all of the problems that brings with it. So I think the really smart management recognizes that pilots need the discretion to exercise their personal minimums. And people need to understand if it's the difference between losing your job and losing your life, well, guess what? You're going to lose both anyway if you end up making a bad decision.
And if your management regards you that way, then you need a new job.
Yep, definitely. No job is worth literally putting your life on the line and literally potentially dying for. Well, you mentioned that you had a rather extreme example of a CFI not doing their job. Tell us about that.
Right. So backing up, when I see a candidate who hasn't assembled personal minimums, I think that there's a flight instructor out there who wasn't doing his or her job. And as you say, I had an example of this just recently where I was giving a private pilot check ride, and this pilot was had an instructor coming to me for bring the candidate to me, and it was about an hour and a half flight to get to me. I ended up getting to the airport early, and I was just sitting and waiting, and I was curious about their progress, so I got on for flight. And, you can turn on the traffic. And I thought, okay, I'll see where they are. And we have some terrain here the plateau is right about at 2,000 feet MSL. And I noticed that the conditions between their departure airport and the airport at which I was sitting there was a lot of marginal. And I saw that the airplane showed an altitude at times of about 275 feet above the ground. And I'm talking above the ground. The airplane was actually below the maximum elevation figure for that section, which means that Maybe they had terrain clearance, but there might have been towers, which are pretty darn hard to see in marginal conditions. And I watched this just with horror. And when they landed, I was simultaneously, of course, relieved that they got there safely, but also just pretty, honestly, I was kind of angry. And the candidate went in the FBO, and I asked the flight instructor to come chat with me. And I had already called the flight school and let them know that I wouldn't be doing the exam that day. And I talked to the flight instructor and I said, here's the deal. When I go in and administer this exam to your student, I'm going to talk about personal minimums. And I want to make sure that, again, that candidate has assembled a reasonable set of personal minimums. And one of those personal minimums is the conditions under which you'd fly VFR. And I know that whatever would come out of his mouth would be a farce. So why on earth would I start a practical exam when I know it's a farce in discussing personal minimums? I think what I'm hoping is that there was a lesson that day. And, ultimately I may go ahead and administer that practical exam, but I just didn't feel like I could do it any justice that day without these two going away and, making sure that they understood why that was so dangerous. And, I need that candidate to have that as a learning experience, that he is never going to do something like that again. It was interesting because the conversation with the instructor didn't exactly go how, I thought it would. He asked me a couple times, well, where do you think I went wrong? What do you think I did wrong? I thought it's pretty obvious when I said that you were, 275 feet, 300 feet above the ground. And he mentioned that he had cloud clearance. And I thought, well, okay, good for you. I'm really more concerned that you have terrain and obstacle clearance. So it took a few circles to get the instructor to understand how dangerous that is. And what he had done with his student, I just can't even describe the damage that he did to that student. Because, what I wanted him to realize, and actually I said this, I said, you are not just teaching when words come out of your mouth. You are teaching by doing. And students look up to flight instructors. And so even if you are off the clock, which of course was not the case in this situation, but even when you're off the clock, people are watching you, right? So we flight instructors have a duty to behave in a way that we want others to emulate. Anyway, I didn't do the exam and I'm still sort of beside myself over it.
Yeah, I think that highlights that personal minimums are not just an academic concept. They're not just theory. You have to put them in practice. And I think you're right. The damage I believe that flight instructor did was that he let the pilot know that it was acceptable to go flying some distance at 275 feet above the ground. Now, you and I would both not do that. That's just not acceptable.
Nope.
Even if he were to say, hey, I met the minimum altitude. I was more than 500 feet from any vehicle, vessel, structure, or person. Guess what? There's another part of that rule that says, and you have to be high enough to be able to deal with any emergency. Well, if you're 275 feet above the ground, that gives you about 15 seconds before you're on the ground. That's certainly not high enough to be able to deal with any emergency. So frankly, I think that there could have been a violation there involved as well. Mm-hmm. We had an accident in this area. This goes back probably 15 to 17 years ago, in which an instructor and a pilot were flying to the checkride and they crashed. Now, that particular flight school used to always use an examiner out in the Central Valley for reasons that I won't even speculate on. But there is a good line of mountains between here and the Central Valley. And so they flew south out of the Reed Hillview Airport, went to the Pacheco Pass, which I think is Highway 152, and it was in the morning, and there were low clouds, and they crashed. The pilot, as I recall, died. The CFI, I do recall, was badly burned in that crash. So, yeah, I mean, there's an example where you just kind of wonder what was going on there. Why were people so desperate to accomplish the mission that they threw basic safety out the window?
Right. So I get it. You have a practical exam. There's another source of pressure, right? There's a shortage of examiners, and it's hard to get an exam scheduled, and it's hard to get an exam scheduled with me. But in doing what they did, now he's back to the end of the line, right? So there's another source of pressure, but you know what? There's always another day to give a practical exam.
Yep, exactly. Well, it kind of goes to what people's talk about accidents. The weather is bad on days of accidents, and the funeral, it's always bright and sunny. So yes, if you just wait a day or two, there's always another day for anything flying related.
Right. And I try to, if somebody ends up getting weathered out, I try to squeeze them in really quickly. But given that there was a lesson to be learned, I didn't feel any compulsion to fit these people in quickly.
Well, let's talk about assembling personal minimums. Why don't we just talk about some of the items, and you and I can talk about our own personal minimums.
Sounds great.
Well, let's talk first about I'm safe.
Yeah. So, it starts with the pilot. We can have a perfect airplane, perfect day, perfect everything, but we need to examine ourselves first. And I think the I'm safe checklist is a good one. So illness, I think it makes sense that if we're under the weather, if we're not on our A game, we really don't belong at the airport. So, and of course, M stands for medication. It's interesting because my understanding that is a very common medication that is found during autopsies is cold medication. So it might be that, you think, it's just cold, I'll just take a little of this and I'll be fine. And you know what? Some of that's it's not compatible with aviation.
And I was just going to say regarding medications, the FAA has a no-go list. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, and it actually shows which ones are sedating, which ones are non-sedating. And a lot of common things that you would just buy over the counter are no-go items, and the FAA requires you to actually, in some cases, wait days until that stuff is out of your system. And it's the common things that you'd find. So people really don't have enough knowledge about this. So definitely take a look at the show notes and the no-go list.
Yeah, absolutely. So stress, which is kind of a funny one to me because every practical exam candidate is stressed, right? So, stress is a funny thing. If we didn't have some stress, we would never do anything in life. But obviously, there's a threshold beyond which, maybe we need to stay away from the airport. So, I get off from a long day at work, and sometimes I'm a bit stressed, and flying is exactly what I need. Because I need to focus my attention on aviation, and I have to get rid of my other cares. So, but again, if you're stressed enough, flying can wait for another day.
Yeah, I tell folks often that flying is great for the normal everyday stresses that we feel, and certainly takes your mind off of those for a couple of hours, and it's a wonderful experience. And yet, if you look at the roughly half dozen life events that people talk about, whether it's marriage, divorce, death in the family, loss of job, maybe moving, I don't know, any of these kinds of things, they generate so much stress that you really don't want to be in the cockpit at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'm hoping alcohol is a no-brainer here. Of course, the FAA mandates at least 8 hours. And I know some of the flight schools say at least 12. And I think that's a nice padding there. And obviously, if you're feeling any of the effects, even if you have waited that certain amount of time, alcohol and aviation are incompatible. Fatigue, though, is kind of an interesting one because I think that's really insidious, right? Because it's easy to know that, yeah, I had a drink however long ago or I didn't, right? That's sort of black-white. But fatigue, how well did you sleep last night? And that's harder for me to quantify. And there are some accidents, some really sad accidents that have been, it looks like fatigue was an issue. And that's pretty hard to pinpoint, right? But it sure looks like fatigue was an issue.
Yes, in fact, I just recently saw an airline pilot said that he is required to sign off before every flight on three different things. One was that he's focused, one is that he's well rested, and the other that he's proficient. Wow, I can't believe I remembered all three of them, but it makes total sense. I've also read that with fatigue, something on the order of 5.5 or 6 hours of sleep gives you the performance equivalent to being drunk at the 0.08 level. So
right.
Yeah, people don't really understand. If you didn't sleep well last night, that is not just means you don't feel well. It means you don't perform well either.
Right. And I think it's great that you are likening it to intoxication because those effects can be really similar. So I know for me personally, I really need to have had a good 6 or 7 hours of sleep. And if I don't get that, I'm just, like I say, I'm on a B or C game. I'm not really on my A game.
Yeah, we always want to bring our A game to flying, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right, talk about the E.
So E can be different things. So for some people, it's eating. I don't have real strong personal minimums there, but there are some people who have to eat every 2 or 3 hours. And, it's all about knowing yourself. So E can sometimes be, emotions. I also like to think about external pressures here too, because that is a personal item. And I think that played a role in the crashes that we were talking about earlier, or I'm guessing it really had to play a role.
Yes, I think the FAA safe checklist says external pressures for the E. I've heard a lot of people say emotion. I tend to lump the emotion in with the S for stress. And for me, it's energy, which kind of translates to eating. And there are times as a flight instructor, I've actually fed my clients because when they show up and they're tired and they're hungry, hey, they're not going to learn very much. So they'll end up getting the banana that I brought for myself or the granola bars because, I'm a full service flight instructor. We do whatever it takes to help our clients.
That's great. Yeah.
Now, let's see, back to eye illness. I just want to mention that years ago, I remember having recovered from a cold, and I think we all know how after the first day or two, we have that euphoric feeling of, yay, I'm no longer sick, and you're out driving and going around, but you're still not quite 100%. And I went flying on one of those days. Flight went fine. When I went to land, I noticed it took absolutely 100% of all of my concentration. I did not have a brain cell to spare. It felt like the hardest thing that I had done. And I realized, you really want to wait until not just you feel good enough to drive, but give it a couple extra days so that you're feeling 98%, 90% healthy. I don't think that's a good time to go flying.
Right.
Well, what about takeoff performance? You told me you had a story about that.
Right. So, back to practical exams, we often talk about takeoff performance. And let's just say that a candidate says that, okay, it's going to take me 1,000 feet for the ground roll based on the weight, atmospheric conditions, winds, and things like that, and maybe 1,500 feet to clear a 50-foot obstacle. So I might say something like, all right, you're taking off from a 1,600-foot runway, and it has a 50-foot tree on the end. Are you going to do it? And, I feel, they say, squirm a little bit and they say, well, you know what, maybe I'm a new pilot. I might add 10, 20%. I just want to say, are you kidding? This has very little to do with your recent flight training. People who are very experienced should add way more. What people don't realize is that of course, they can tell you that was on a perfect day with a test pilot and all of that. But these engines over time, as the metal wears out and goes away and all of those oil changes, and maybe it's not producing the power anymore, this has to do, or, one of the major factors is the performance of the engine. And for example, I had an engine overhauled in my Cessna Aerobat a few years ago, and the climb rate that I got when the new engine came back was over double what it had been with that tired out engine. So for me, I add at least 50 to 100% of what I get. So if it says I need 1,500 feet to clear a 50-foot obstacle, then I'm going to not take off in anything, say, less than 3,000 feet of runway, just to have those robust minimums. And, I think another thing that we should always do too is double check our comfort level. Like years ago, I was taking my kids on a vacation, and my home airport is the runways, on the shorter side, and it's surrounded by big trees and all of that, which, by the way, are taller than 50 feet. But I ran the calculations, and everything was fine. Even with my kind of robust minimums, I just wasn't feeling it. And I just didn't feel like I would get Mother of the Year for putting my kids in the plane with the bags and taking off. There was just something that didn't feel right to me. So what I ended up doing is, again, you never have to take off, right? So what I ended up doing was I took my kids and I drove them down to the nearby airport, whose runway is 1,300 feet longer. The altitude is 1,000 feet lower. And I just dropped them off. And I drove back up to my home airport. I took off by myself, and, it was easy. And I would have had the performance, but I just wasn't feeling it. But I landed at the nearby airport. We packed up and we went off on our vacation, and we had a great time. So, you should never be in a position where you feel like you have to take off. There's always something you can do. There's always something you could do to mitigate that risk. And for me, it was easy. It took an extra hour and we were on our way.
I think that's important for people to remember that GA flying is not like flying the airlines. And there are times we are going to be inconvenienced. And yeah, there are times when things are going to take an extra hour or two just because we do extra care to make sure that we're safe when we're flying. Talk about wins and also filing IFR.
Okay, so I'll say I'm curious what your personal minimums are here too, Max. Wins, my airport. Okay, so my airport has runways 6 and 24, and I'm convinced that years ago they did a study of prevailing winds. And that they favored 1533, and so they built 624. So we always have a crosswind. We're right at the edge of a plateau, so we get not only a crosswind, but swirling winds. We've got these high trees. The winds change because of that. Anyway, it's crazy, the winds that we get. So I am routinely taking off and landing with some pretty interesting winds. So my personal minimums for winds are actually pretty low. I feel comfortable flying in winds where, other folks would probably keep the plane in the hangar. For IFR though, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, I have not flown as much IFR as I did before because, the COVID thing, and I didn't go on as many trips. And so my IFR mins have actually become more conservative because I just don't get the practice in, the recent practice that I'm used to getting. So when I start going on more trips, those will probably change a bit, but I'm just going to guess that my IFR mins are a good bit more conservative than yours because, Max, you fly IFR with greater regularity than I do.
Sure. Let me talk about both wins and IFR. So for winds, for takeoff and landing, I'll actually go to the max crosswind limit, but that includes the gust. So if the max crosswind limit on the Cirrus is 20 knots and it's 15 gusting to 22, well, then that would exceed the minimums, because my concern is that if you have bad luck and bad timing and that gust happens at that value at the wrong time, hey, you've just exceeded the max crosswind. And the airport that I grew up at in Pennsylvania had crosswinds all the time, which I think is probably what helped me learn to handle crosswinds early on. The other aspect of winds is when we're flying in the mountains, Often we're doing trips to Tahoe, doing mountain checkouts for people. And those airports are at about 6,000 feet, and the hills between here and there go up 10,000, 11,000 feet, depending upon where you are. And so I'm always looking for the winds aloft. If the winds aloft are greater than 25 knots, then I'm not going, because I know we're going to have a lot of updrafts and downdrafts, and that the conditions at the airports are going to be squirrely. So I'm much more concerned about winds in the mountains than I am down in the flatlands.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, back to sort of winds, IFR, that kind of thing. So my rule is, for me personally, night, mountainous terrain, IMC, pick one. Like I don't do mountains at night. I really don't do IFR at night. I might, maybe if the clouds are up high, I will, but I don't do anything approaching IFR conditions at night. Anyway, so yeah, those are just a bit more on my IFR mins.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And then in terms of IFR, I have to explain that the IFR conditions that we have here in Northern California are quite different than the IFR people experience in other parts of the country. We have IFR practically every morning. It's not quite that bad, but that's because we're right next to the Pacific Ocean. We get a low layer of clouds that roll in many, many, many nights of the year, probably at least half to 2/3 of the nights of the year. And we wake up with a cloud layer that's anywhere from, depending on where you are, 800 to 1,000 feet, sometimes a little higher. And that layer may be a few hundred feet thick. It might be a couple thousand feet thick. And it's stratus cloud, so it's very non-turbulent. It's very stable. And so we get a lot of IFR practice in probably what you consider the best possible IFR conditions. We're not rolling around in storms and cumulus clouds and things like that. So we often are flying to minimums, and it's relatively easy compared to flying to minimums that you might find in the Midwest or back east or things like that, because it's a very stable environment. And the reason that I do fly to minimums is because almost all my flying is instructional. And so I want people to see, hey, what does this look like at minimums? And I would say the vast majority of the time we're not landing at minimums. We're flying the missed approach, because that's also an important skill to have. But I would say that your IFR minimums probably are situational dependent as well. They could vary based upon how long has it been since you've done an IPC, how long has it been since you have done a couple of instrument approaches, what kind of weather are you actually flying in, how familiar are you with the particular approach. I can see people's IFR minimums varying a little bit depending upon the situation. Certainly mine do. Now, I would not fly to minimums back east, for example. I had a Vision Jet trip in which there was a couple hundred miles of IFR where minimums were 200 to 300 feet. So theoretically, we could have gotten into any of those places. But if we had to fly mist, well, now we didn't have any other good options, and we would be low on fuel and down low where the fuel burns are high. So in that case, we flew a good 130 miles out of the way to Little Rock, where we had ceilings of 900 feet, which, at that point, we were pretty confident we were going to be able to get in. But with all the other airports at 200 and 300, yeah, it was 50-50 luck of the draw as to whether you'd get in, and then you'd really be in trouble.
Yeah, and you bring up an excellent point about IMC looking different in different parts of the country. So, I'm used to the weather patterns in the Southeast. I am not used to the weather patterns as a pilot, even though I grew up in your area. I'm not used to the weather patterns as a pilot there. So that's a very different thing.
Well, let's talk about some other personal minimums. You mentioned, for example, recent instruction and continuing education. Go ahead and relate that to us.
For me, IFR, I just don't get the trips in that I would like. So what I like to do is I like to get routine IPCs. Just make sure I get a checkout from a good instructor. If you're not getting the kind of recent experience IFR like is the situation with me, then I think it makes sense to go out and get some find someone who is a really good instructor and spend a few hours, spend the day with that person.
All right, let's talk about some of the other personal minimums. I've pulled up the PAVE checklist that the FAA has, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. For example, they talk about visibility. Talk about some of your visibility minimums, and I'll talk about some of mine.
I am really not a big fan of marginal. If I am flying VFR, visual flight rules, I'm going to want solid VMC conditions. And even though we can fly around kind of low, I mean, let's face it, class golf, 1 mile viz clear of clouds, seriously. So mine are way beyond that. I like at bare minimum 5 miles visibility, even if I'm taking off from a class golf airport. And I like to have a ceiling of at least several thousand feet. When I flew to New Hampshire and back, interestingly, those were VFR trips. And, when I flew out there, I flew at 9,500. When I flew back, I flew at 10,500. I like altitude. So, because if something were to happen, you fly long enough, things are going to happen, right? So I like to make sure that I have as large a gliding range as possible. So for me, flying VFR, it's going to be at least several thousand feet of altitude. How about you?
Well, so mine vary tremendously simply because we've got so much terrain in the area here. If I were going to stay in the traffic pattern, or if I were going to go to one of the airports that's in the South Bay, those would be airports where they're all virtually at sea level. There are no obstructions between us. And literally, in terms of obstructions, we don't have the kind of tall towers that you see in other parts of the country. It's common in the rest of the country to have a 1,500-foot or taller television tower. Here in California, we have mountains, and so they build short towers on top of those mountains. I can only think of one place where we've got towers that reach up to 2,000 feet in the flatlands. So I don't have to worry about obstacles very much in this area. But for me, if I'm going to stay local to go to one of these other airports, which are 5-10 miles away, 1,500 feet would be the bare minimum. And that's because the ceiling bottoms vary. Mm-hmm. Maybe at 1,500 feet here. Hopefully, it's not going to be less than 1,000 feet. That gives me a little bit of margin. And of course, that's because we're dealing with stratus clouds. Stratiform clouds are very smooth and very even. If you're in an area with cumulus clouds, wow, that's probably not going to be enough ceiling height for people. If I were going to Livermore, which is over the first mountain ridge, then I'd want to see probably close to 3,000-foot clouds. And then going beyond there, probably closer to 3,500 feet, just to be able to get over the two lower ridges that we have. So again, fairly variable depending upon how far I'm going. Mm-hmm. If it's in close, then lower minimums are certainly appropriate. Now, I will fly just for demonstration purposes to let other students, pilots see what it looks like in 3 to 4 mile visibility, and we'll stay extremely close to the airport. We may not get more than 5 miles away, but I only do that because I think it's important for people to see how bad does 3 to 4 mile visibility look. And frankly, I would never go anywhere in that kind of visibility. To me, 5 miles is probably about the minimum for me to go somewhere. But I think people have no concept of what does 3 to 4 miles look like until they get into it. So I'd like to have them experience that safely with a flight instructor who knows what that looks like and kind of point that out to them. And also in an area where we're confident that we don't have any obstructions that we're going to have to deal with. Now, from IFR standpoint, my minimums are that I will never take off in weather that's so poor that I can't get back into the airport that I just took off from. And there's one exception to that, and that's if there's an airport that I'm going to be flying over within a matter of a couple minutes after takeoff, which is nicely aligned. So, for example, there used to be fairly high minimums getting into the Reed Hillview airport, and yet on takeoff, you were headed directly toward the San Jose airport, and I could have that ILS tuned in a matter of seconds since I had that frequency memorized. And from time to take off from Reed Hillview to time to setting down on the ground at San Jose is probably less than 5 minutes. And that would be far less time to get vectored back around to Reed Hillview, where we have high minimums anyway. And one of the things pilots can do, and I don't think this is taught very commonly, is that they can load their navigator with a takeoff alternate instrument approach.
Right.
So in other words, if you are taking off from your airport and you need to come back to your airport, it would make sense to just go ahead and load the approach to your airport before you even take off. Now, the trick is that once you put in your destination, most of the navigators default to presenting approaches at your destination airport. And it's really easy to get out of that. And the Garmin devices, essentially, you're just going to be pushing the FMS knob to take the cursor off of the approaches at your destination. You're going to roll the outer knob up to the airport field, and then you're going to enter your home airport, hit enter, and then it will show you all the approaches for your home airport. So really great, I think, anytime people are taking off in IFR, just go ahead and load a takeoff alternate so that you have an approach loaded that you can go to immediately after takeoff.
Max, you sound like you've written a book on this or something.
Well, I must say I love IFR. It's a fun mental challenge. And of course, it's just something that pilots need to either really be good at or decide not to do it. I remember someone giving a presentation at Oshkosh one time who was a pilot aviation writer. And what the pilot said when asked about why he or she hadn't gotten their instrument rating, the pilot said, I've decided that I won't do it enough to stay proficient, and that's why I haven't gotten my instrument rating. And I thought that was a rather good insight.
Yeah, again, it goes back to knowing yourself.
Indeed. Any other things you want to talk about as we wrap up here on personal minimums?
I usually joke that driving is what other people do, but many times every year, it's exactly what I choose to do, or flying commercially is what other people do. But, Max, sometimes I do that. And I've always found that if it's disappointed anybody, it doesn't take long to get over. So I think you and I are out to be, pilots and flying safely as long as possible.
Definitely. And I think that's the goal. I think the goal is to have our flying end because we've gotten so old that we no longer pass the medical, not because we have screwed up and didn't take our flying as seriously as we should.
Yeah, my goal is to still be doing this in 80 years.
Yeah, good. Let's both plan on that.
Deal.
Good. Catherine, where do people find out more about you and your work?
So I write the Flying Smart column for AOPA Pilot Magazine. I run an aerobatic school here in Tennessee, acaerobaticschool.com. And I'm also director for the Swanee Flying Tigers. I've helped my university start its own flight school. So I have a lot of jobs, but fortunately, I love every one of them.
Catherine, thanks so much for joining us here again today.
Max, it's always great. Thanks for having me.
And my thanks to Catherine Cavagnaro for being one of our regulars here on the show. You'll find links to Catherine's flight school and her YouTube channel in our show notes. And I want to thank all of you that contribute to the show in whatever way you do. Thanks so much to those of you who send me your emails and your questions, those who support the show financially, those who leave us 5-star reviews on whatever podcast player that you're listening to, and especially to all of you who've told your friends about this show. And if you haven't done that, this might be a good show to suggest that they listen to. That's the main way we grow the show, so thanks so much for taking time to tell other people about the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.